everyone, and thanks for joining us for the ANA e-Learning Academy. We're so happy that you can join us here in the evening. I hope this time works well for you. We have a special presentation. This is a Sundman lecture series. For those that don't know, the Sundman lecture series and the money talks that are all happening the month of August were planned for the World's Fair of Money actually this week in Pittsburgh, but due to the cancellation, we've moved them all to e-learning. So hopefully, if you weren't going to go to Pittsburgh, you were able to join us now, which is really exciting. If you get questions or come up with questions during this presentation, please use the chat feature or the Q&A feature here in Zoom to send your questions. I'll read them to Jack at the end of his presentation, and he'll answer them aloud for everybody. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to launch a survey here in Zoom. So if you'll take the time to fill it out, it'll help us to do better in the future if we need to, and let us know what you thought of this presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jack. He's going to talk on the influence of Anna W. Williams in Numismatics. Enjoy.
Thank you, Brianna. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening to wherever you are. I'm in New Jersey, so it's currently 7:30 here. But good evening to you. Good morning if you're in Australia. Good afternoon wherever you are. Welcome to the influence of Anna W. Williams in Numismatics. I am honored to be here. I wanted to first thank Brianna for having me and the ANA for having me. I wanted to go over the breakdown of the presentation first with all of you, okay? So let's go ahead and go down. So this is broken up into 4 chapters. So the first chapter is going to be early life and society. The second chapter is why the Morgan dollar. The third chapter is the goddess of liberty. And chapter 4 is Anna Willess Williams, the legacy that she wanted. And like Brianna said, questions, comments, thoughts at the end. So let's go into chapter 1, early life and society. Let's first go over some chapter highlights. We're going to go over some basic biographical facts of Anna Williams. We're going to talk about her family tree, some relevant census records, what Philadelphia was like in the 1850s, and then we're very briefly going to talk about the booming Antebellum Philadelphian economy in 1850. So Anna Willess Williams was born on August 15th, 1857 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Her 163rd birthday is actually 9 days from today, which is pretty neat. I am aware of some discrepancies in terms of her birth year, but as we'll discuss, I'm going to go off of the census and death certificate year that's listed. So we're going to go with 1857. That's going to be our working year. Her family situation was difficult growing up. And I'm going to preface it by saying Henry Williams was her father, and Eliza Williams, her maiden name was Willis. Anna Willess Williams was her mother. We learned from Anna Williams that her situation was rather unfortunate. They were unfortunately in a poor financial state at the time of when Anna was born. We learned this from Anna Williams's only public interview in 1892. It says that Anna Williams was born under, quote, the most adverse circumstances, end quote. That was because of her father's, quote, mismanagement, end quote, with their finances, further compounding her situation when her father Henry died when she was very young. So according to this same interview, she was one of 9 children, although I was unable to find most of those siblings other than her 2 recorded brothers, William and Samuel, and her sister Elizabeth in the census records that I'm about to show you. So what does this mean for her early childhood? She, like I said, had a very difficult childhood. She's now fatherless growing up, and she and her mother and the rest of her siblings are unfortunately the recipient of her father's poor financial mistakes. It was up to Anna's mother, Eliza, to take care, raise, educate Anna and her siblings in a society that wasn't exactly nice to single mothers. So like I said, let's go over the family tree. I do want to note that you can move your my face here on Zoom. So if it's in the corner or something blocking the way, you can go ahead and move that. But I'm going to point over to the different squares here. I made this brief family tree for all of you to see. We can see that this is in relation to Anna Williams. So Anna Williams is going to be the starting person, and I'm going to refer to these people as they would be referred to by her. We can see her parents here, Henry and Eliza, like I said. And we can see her maternal grandparents, Nancy and Arthur Willis. Notice how there is no paternal grandparents. That's because I saw no record of them in any census records that I came across. So I did not include them because I could not find them. We're also supposed to see 5 other siblings in addition to these 3 siblings. However, I didn't find them as well. We do know from Anna's interview in 1892 that she was one of 9. But as we're about to see in census records, that Elizabeth, William, and Samuel are the only other siblings that are listed. As for the birth years, you'll notice how many of them are about here in the maternal grandparents, her mother, her father, and 2 of her siblings. That's because they may have shown up in either 1 or 2 census records and nothing further. So their approximate birth dates are from the date that is listed in the census, their age, subtracted from the census date. So in this case, for the maternal grandparents, they were born in the 18th century. There's no further record of them, and so on. I'm sure any genealogists in here would understand the struggle of finding primary sources that are consistent with providing good information. So let's talk about briefly Samuel Williams. He was born in 1848 and he died in 1918. Something interesting to note that'll be important for chapter 4 is that, chapter 4 of this presentation, is that Anna Williams acted as the informant for the Bureau of Vital Statistics when Samuel passed away. She's the one that provided the information to the Bureau of Vital Statistics. So that's how we learn of his full date instead of an about. So here we can see the 1850 census. I made a snippet of this. We can see here that Henry Williams is listed. I do want to note this red bar here, that any red bar that you see on primary source documents like the census, I've added that for emphasis. So this red bar here is emphasis in mind. We're focusing on Henry Williams. So this is 1850. This is 7 years before Anna's born. But this is good idea for showing you, this is good to show you the actual base story of their family. So if we scroll back here, we can see Nancy, Arthur, her grandparents, her grandparents, her parents, Henry and Eliza, and then the siblings are listed here. So we can see Arthur, he's 65. Nancy, his wife, 62. Martha, who was not listed in that family tree, that's Eliza's sister. So in relation to Anna Williams, that would be her Aunt Martha. Here we have her father, 37, who was living with them at the time of the census. So Henry and Eliza are living with the rest of the Willis family in the same household. And we can see Eliza's children, Elizabeth, William, and Samuel. And then we have Miss Mary here, who was born in Ireland. She was also living with them at the time. So let's focus on the 1880 census real quick. We've got the street name here. We've got Eliza Williams. So important thing to notice, Henry Williams is not here. Henry Williams is not listed. Henry Williams, unfortunately, like we learned from Anna Williams, passed away when she was young. So in 1880, she was not part of the family picture. We can see William here and Samuel, her siblings, and then extra emphasis here is on Anna Williams, of course, who is listed as a school teacher, which is very important to note as we progress in this presentation. But you can see here Eliza is, in fact, keeping house. And finally, we'll take a look at the 1900 census, the 12th census of the United States. We see Anna Williams here. She is the head of the household. We do notice her brother Edward, actually Samuel, but listed as Edward in the census. And then her niece, Catherine here, who will be making another appearance at the end of this presentation. So she's important to note. But notice how there's a different age here. There's a different age listed right here, 1858. This is because of, quite frankly, could be an error. This could be very well just an error, and we're going to consider that just an error in record keeping in terms of the census. We're going to focus on the birthday that's listed from previous census records and from the death certificate, like I said. So now that we know a bit about her family, we know a bit about her immediate family, her grandparents, we know more about her childhood a little bit. Let's bring it back from 1900 back to the 1850s and talk about Philadelphia when she was growing up. Okay, this is Philadelphia in 1850, so pre-Civil War. We're going to be talking about Philadelphia in the 1850s as described by British travelers. So this is a really good reference in terms of really understanding what it was like in terms of a visual sense from the perspective of individuals who came over here from England. So we have British tourists here visiting, and they are making really detailed notes and references about their stay in Philadelphia. And inadvertently, it gives us a really good picture of what it was like from an international perspective, or the perspective of someone that wasn't there, which would be us, because we're looking at that from the perspective of 2020. We're looking at it from hundreds of years in the future. So I should say 100 years in the future, 150 or so. Let's take a look at what the British tourists say about Philadelphia. I selected this, like I said, for the perspective, and I wanted to talk about what Dr. Ivan Steen, who wrote this, he talked about visitors visiting the U.S. Mint. And obviously, I wanted to include this in a discussion about numismatics in Philadelphia. He included topic on British visitors visiting the U.S. Mint. So I'd like to read you a quote from Dr. Steen about visitors to the U.S. Mint in Philadelphia in 1850. Excuse me. So he writes, quote, "A trip to Philadelphia was hardly complete without a visit to the United States Mint on Chestnut Street. At the door of this white marble edifice, which resembled a Greek temple, travelers were greeted by a guide who conducted them through the building," end quote. I find this quote particularly interesting for two reasons. The first mention is the Greek style, the Greek influence in the architecture, which is important to note for the design of the Morgan dollar, as we'll get to. And it's important to me that even 170 years ago, I'm correcting what I said, I said 200 years in the future. It was 170 years from 1850. Even 170 years ago, the U.S. Mint in Philadelphia was still giving tours just like they do today, which I found pretty interesting. But for the rest of general society in Philadelphia, Dr. Steen goes to great lengths to describe the particular detailed reviews of British tourists that really describe the city in great detail very well. So much so it paints a full picture, like I said, of what the city looked like at that era. So let's go to page 38 of what Dr. Steen said. He starts to describe the local economy, starting with the local shopping experience, saying, quote, "Among the sights of Philadelphia were its extensive markets, the largest of which was located on Market Street. Here, under a covered arcade, travelers noticed stalls on either side of the street in which were displayed various kinds of meat, fruit, vegetables, and flowers. Englishmen were amazed at the large quantities of great variety of provisions to be seen in this market," end quote. So we learn with this that street shops residing on the aptly named Market Street featured well-stocked inventories of goods to be sold in the city, giving the city a vibrant everyday marketplace. Further down, we learn that transportation is up to date in that time with locomotive tracks, saying, Dr. Steen saying, quote, "Many of the streets of the Quaker city were lined with iron rails, indicating that the city had an extensive street railway system consisting of horse-drawn cars," end quote. So this is important in relation to Anna Williams because this is what life was like for her growing up. She had the market on Market Street, which sounds, a little funny, but that's what it was. It was Market Street. She could go there with her mother or her siblings and pick up whatever she needed. That's what life was like. It wasn't like the 7-Eleven down the street randomly placed. She had to go to Market Street. Stuff like that helps paint the picture of what it was like in 1850 for Anna Williams and her siblings and her mother growing up. But even with a description of somewhat mundane daily life, what was the economic situation like? So we're going to take a quick look at Philadelphia's antebellum economy, and we're going to reference Philadelphia, quote, Philadelphia, the American Industrial Center, 1750 to 1850, by Thomas C. Cochrane. So the next resource, like I said, is that title from Mr. Cochrane in 1982. We learned from Mr. Cochrane's work at the end of his journal article that coal was the major export and source of income for the city of Philadelphia in 1850. With Cochrane writing, quote, coal made the port of Philadelphia the national leader in volume of exports, end quote. Cochrane on the next page further adds, quote, the area that by 1854 consolidation of city and country was to become Philadelphia contained 500,000 people. It was bigger than any English city save London, end quote. So what does this tell us? What does this tell us? It tells us that Philadelphia was a booming city, having a growing population, and it was the leading exporter in the US than any other city, thanks to coal. So what does this mean for Anna Williams? Well, like I said with Dr. Steen's work, it helps address the type of life in Philadelphia. It helps to set the picture, set the stage for what it was like in 1850 Philadelphia. And these are two great resources, like I said, on understanding them. If you're interested in reading more about them, I highly recommend those sources. They give you a great perspective on everyday life in Philadelphia at that time. But I wanted to include that in this presentation about Anna Williams because it helps, like I said, set the stage for what it was like for her growing up. What kind of city life was that for her growing up? So now that we learned about Anna Williams' genealogy, what life was like in 1850 very briefly, and what made the economy roar, let's move to one of the key questions in this presentation. Why the Morgan dollar? So some chapter highlights. We're going to really be discussing in this chapter and the third chapter of this presentation the comprehensive catalog and encyclopedia of Morgan and Peace dollars by Leroy Van Allen and A. George Mallis. That is the key resource, especially page 75, as we'll get to, on learning about the relationship Anna Williams had with George Morgan and her numismatic experience. So chapter highlights, we're going to go over who George Morgan is briefly, who Dr. Linderman is. We're going to talk about the 25th and 45th Congresses of the U.S. We're going to talk about the new coin that needed to be made, and we're going to dissect some sentences from Van Allen and Mallis's comprehensive catalog, page 75. So, who is George Morgan? Probably one of the biggest questions of this, other than who Anna Williams is. That story begins with a man many of you may already know if you collect Morgan dollars. That was designer and engraver George T. Morgan from Birmingham, England, who moved to the U.S. in 1876 to design the coin that we're talking about. So this is Mr. Morgan right here. Like I said, he's from Birmingham, England. He's seated here on this front row. That is a picture of Mr. Morgan, the image thanks to the Department of the Treasury. So now that we know a little bit about George Morgan and who he is, why did this coin need to be created? What was the motivation for even designing a new coin in 1876? And how did Mr. Morgan come across Anna Williams? How did that happen? How did he meet the seemingly everyday school teacher? Like we mentioned in the previous slide on the census slide, her occupation was a school teacher. How did he meet this seemingly average individual? So we learn why this coin was to be made thanks to, like I said, A. George Mallis and Leroy Van Allen in the comprehensive catalog and encyclopedia of Morgan and Peace dollars. And through that, we learn that answer to that question, why do we need a coin in 1876, a new design for a coin, lies with one individual, and that individual is Dr. Henry Richard Linderman, this individual right here, he was the director of the U.S. Mint from 1873 to 1879. Van Allen and Mallis, in the second paragraph of their book's 5th chapter, puts it very bluntly, saying, quote, Linderman wanted to change the silver coinage designs in 1876 and needed additional engravers, end quote. So one of, if not the main reason that we got one of America's most quintessential designs, according to chapter 5 of Van Allen and Mallis, was simply because Dr. Linderman, as the director of the U.S. Mint, wanted a new design, which is interesting to me that he just wanted one. But remember, Dr. Linderman couldn't oversee or approve just any design. So let's talk about that, the restrictions on U.S. coins in terms of design. That responsibility lies, as we're about to learn, with the Congress of the United States. So congressional limitations put on the U.S. Mint and subsequently George Morgan, or any other designer or engraver for that matter, were codified into law way back in 1837 with the Act of January 18, 1837. This particular session was session 2, and we're going to focus on chapter 3 of that law. It's not exactly an exciting name for an important piece of legislation, but I digress. I wanted to focus mainly on 2 sections of this. Like I said, implemented legal parameters to coin design. So section 1, and let me back up a bit. We learn why it exists, the design. It's because of Dr. Linderman's request. But why does the Morgan dollar look the way it does to an extent? And like I said, that's because of legal parameters to the coin's design. So in short, section 1, this gives official titles to officers of the U.S. Mint. This is important because we're remembering who designed this coin. Like I said, it was George Morgan of England, who under this law in section 1 became an officer of the Mint, the U.S. Mint, despite being a new member of the team in 1876. So it's amazing how quickly George Morgan rose through the ranks in the U.S. Mint and becoming this lead designer of this coin. It puts a certain emphasis and importance and credibility to his work, especially for his rendering of Anna Williams. But this idea of Lady Liberty has to come from somewhere. And that's exactly what section 13 of this law addresses. It says, quote, upon one side of each said coins there shall be an impression emblematic of liberty, end quote. So we learn in 1837 that an impression emblematic of liberty was to be on silver dollars. In this case, this upcoming silver dollar. So George Morgan, with his new and important job, is tasked with making a very specific design. His creative mind now had these legal parameters as his first responsibility. So his creative mind has all of these ideas, but now, upon coming to the U.S. Mint and working for the U.S. Mint, he had to make sure that whatever he made, it was up to the standards set by Congress. So now we know who Morgan is, very briefly. He's now an officer of the Mint. And we know that this coin that he's designing or needs to design has to look a certain way to an extent. But where do we find out more information? And that's where, like I like to call them, the Morgan dollar scholars, Van Allen and Mallis, come in again. They describe the history and the design in chapter 5 of their book, which is aptly named Development of the Design. The entire chapter serves, as we just had a brief experience with, as an amazing reference for anyone interested in the story of the design from start to finish. It just so happens that we're focusing on Anna Williams, but if you're interested in learning more about, the different types of the design, the different pattern coins, I highly recommend you read that chapter of the Comprehensive Catalog and Encyclopedia of Morgan Dollars. I only say that because some of you may already know that if you collect Morgan Dollars, but those of you don't, that is a great resource like I'm citing here in this presentation. So like I said, this book, top resource for Morgan Dollars collectors, and it's the top resource, in my opinion, on learning about Anna Williams meeting George Morgan. So instead of reading the entire chapter, I want to focus on the key facts that Van Allen and Mallis write in this chapter, namely that we learn who George Morgan is and that he's a designer and engraver from England. All of this found on page 75. So what else does Van Allen and Mallis tell us? We learn from page 75 that George Morgan, quote, enrolled in the fall of 1876 as a student at the Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia, end quote. It's important to note that Van Allen and Mallis also said he, quote, made profile studies of Greek figures, end quote. Again, we're seeing this Greek reference, this Grecian reference come up again. First, we talked about it in 1850, how the U.S. Mint, their architecture of the U.S. Mint building in Philadelphia was Greek style, had a Grecian look to it. And here we learn that George Morgan is also studying this type of art. But for now, we know that George Morgan added to his formal education, his formal art education in 1876. The next paragraph is really key, as far as I'm concerned, in this whole book in regards to Anna Williams. Van Allen and Mallis explain that George Morgan wanted an accurate depiction of an American woman to represent liberty on an American coin, which to me is not a surprising position for Mr. Morgan to take. So the next sentence explains it all, with Van Allen and Mallis saying, quote, the model he chose was introduced to him by a friend, Thomas Eakins, an independent artist with a wide reputation. The next sentence says, quote, she was Miss Anna Willess Williams, a fair-haired girl of 19 who was the daughter of Henry Williams of Philadelphia, end quote. So there's a lot to work there. There's a lot to work with there in terms of dissecting those two sentences, and that's what I'd like to do right now with all of you. In those two sentences, we learned that George Morgan is friends with Thomas Eakins, that Eakins is a relatively famous artist, which is important for chapter 4 that we'll get to, chapter 4 of this presentation. Eakins is a relatively famous artist. We know that from these two sentences that Anna Williams knew Eakins through her father, and that her father was from Philadelphia, as we confirmed in the genealogy. We also learned that Anna Williams was 19 at the time of meeting George Morgan, which is also important, like I said, for her birth year of 1857. And to me, the most important part is that Van Allen and Mallis confirm in this chapter that it was Anna Willess Williams who acted as George Morgan's model for the basis of the Morgan dollar design. So that's a lot of information packed in two sentences, right? With this information, it forms a great basis of understanding on how it all kind of came together. So Van Allen and Mallis establish a lot of facts, but most important, we learn that Morgan and Williams meet. And at some point, Williams sits down with Morgan so he can use her portrait in his design. We also learn in this chapter from Van Allen and Mallis that Williams was quite reserved and initially not interested, but eventually persuaded, especially by her friends, to sit with George Morgan. And that we learned that there were total 5 sittings between Morgan and Williams completed at Thomas Eakins' home in 1876, according to the ANA's Numismatist magazine in May of 1926. So let's fast forward 2 years to 1878. Excuse me. And we soon realize why Dr. Linderman was brilliant for planning ahead in terms of wanting a new coin design 2 years earlier. Like the previous Congress that we mentioned, the 45th U.S. Congress decides to contribute, in a way, to numismatics by passing Public Law 4520. This is known as, in public, the Bland-Allison Act. And many of you who took high school history may have heard this before, high school U.S. history. The Bland-Allison Act, which got its name from the congressman involved with the bill, Representative Richard Bland of Missouri, and Senator William Allison of Iowa. And this was passed in February of 1878. So you might be asking, what is so special about the Bland-Allison Act? What is so special about Public Law 4520? The answer is that it required the U.S., the United States government, to purchase silver from American miners and mint silver coins to be used as legal tender. It required large purchases of silver, the text of the law specifically saying, quote, that not less than $2 million worth per month, no more than $4 million per month, end quote. of silver be purchased and then used, minted, and distributed as legal usable coinage to the public. So the government's buying a lot of silver. So what? What did this big change mean for society? What does this mean for society? It means that this big change to society introduces, or it was planned to introduce, new money for society. It was on its way to the general public, and it gave silver miners in the US a very important sense of job security. It meant that millions of dollars were to be spent every month on purchasing American silver. Keep in mind, these are $1878. The minimum requirement of the law was $2 million a month in 1878. So $2 million in 1878. That would, according to an inflation calculator, be just over 51 million United States dollars every month in today's dollars, in 2020 dollars, which is a lot of money to be spending every month on silver. Besides the economic impact of these large purchases per month, it meant that silver needed to be converted into a usable vehicle as a means of currency. This means a new coin must be made to accommodate the requirements of the legislation, whose text in the first line says, quote, that there shall be coined at the several mints of the United States silver dollars of the weight of 412.5 grains troy of standard silver, end quote. So now the United States at this point was not just expecting to have a big surge of new dollar coins, but it was requiring it by law. And it was Dr. Linderman's job as head of the US Mint to make it happen on the ground at the physical level. So again, we needed a new coin. Perfect. We've been planning for this new design for 2 years. Perfect timing. Anna Williams did her part by sitting with George Morgan and resumed to her normal activities as a school teacher, as we learned. It wouldn't be for some time until Anna Williams was known by her new nickname. And what was that, you might ask? The Goddess of Liberty. So we're entering chapter 3 of the presentation. So again, we're going to reference the Comprehensive Catalog and Encyclopedia of Morgan and Peace Dollars by Leroy Van Allen and A. George Mallis, chapter 5, which is page 75, like I've been mentioning. That's going to be the key resource in learning about how fame affected Anna Williams. Like I previously said, I like to mention Mr. Van Allen and Mr. Mallis as our Morgan Dollar scholars. So they help us learn about the Anna Williams story, especially in terms of her reaction to fame. And it's not the only resource that we're going to be looking at, but it's a great one that answers a lot of questions. So the chapter highlights for this chapter, we learned about the design, we learned about how that happened. This is after the fact. This is after 1878. This is after coins featuring Anna Williams is being introduced and struck at the mints. So we're going to go over the infatuation of the public, the identification of Anna Williams. We're going to talk about, picture this, you are Anna Williams. We're going to go over the effects of fame, the reaction, and then we're going to talk about the Numismatist magazine from the American Numismatic Association. So, like I said, it brings us to chapter 3, titled The Goddess of Liberty, which is what people refer to her as after 1879. And that's important to remember what year that was that people started to refer to her as that. It's 1879. Although it's humbling to be revered as the emblem and physical representation of the virtue of liberty, Anna Williams, at the end of the day, was still Anna Williams. The way I think about it is, if you have a famous actor nowadays play a character in a very well-received movie, and then outside of that film in public, people still refer to that actor as that character, having the same attributes and personality as the person they're portraying, which almost always is not the case. So think of a famous actor that you know of that played a famous role, and then people assume that that actor is actually that character, which very oftentimes is not the case. They have their own personality, obviously. So this is what I suspect Anna Williams experienced. Just by nature of being a model for a coin, she became a national celebrity almost overnight. But how did this happen? Something clearly happened where Anna Williams was revealed to be the so-called goddess of liberty. So again, how did this happen? Bringing us to the identification of Anna Williams. Again, our Morgan Dollar scholars, as I like to call them, Van Allen and Mallis, answered this question as well on page 75 of the comprehensive catalog, as I mentioned, saying, quote, the identity of Morgan, hit the wrong button there. The identity of Morgan's model was kept secret until the summer of 1879, like I mentioned, when a newspaper man discovered that her likeness, as good as a photograph, was on the silver dollar, end quote. So how frustrating this must have been for Anna Williams, who was expecting this to be a secret, to be revealed by the newspaper man she might have just gotten the newspaper from that day. The newspaper man may have seen the new dollar coins. He may be actually receiving them in exchange for the newspaper, and then quite possibly knew Anna Williams from his delivery route, or somehow made the conclusion that, wow, this woman that I know really looks a lot like the lady on this coin. So I can't even imagine how frustrating that must have been for Anna Williams, which is why, for just a second, we're going to picture that we are Anna Williams. You are Anna Williams. So if we're going to imagine that we're Anna Williams, or in this case, you, the viewer, is Anna Williams, you know Thomas Eakins, the relatively famous artist, because of your father, Henry. And this famous artist, Mr. Eakins, introduces you to his acquaintance, Mr. Morgan, Mr. George Morgan, whose job is to redesign the American silver dollar. After persuasion and hesitation, because you're a relatively reserved person, you agree to be modeled for this coin, but with the request that your identity be remained a secret. Your identity stays a secret, and that request is honored. And then suddenly 3 years later, after sitting with Mr. Morgan, out of the blue, a random newspaper man one day puts 2 and 2 together, and then suddenly you are the goddess of liberty. And suddenly, subsequently, you're inundated with fame and recognition that you really don't want. So from what we've gathered here today from Van Allen and Mallis and our other sources, I believe that description, that exercise, is a very fair, albeit brief, shortened representation of how it all unfolded and how Anna Williams became famous overnight. So again, we're going to refer to our Morgan Dollar scholars, Van Allen and Mallis. What do they say about this? Surely this sudden fame must have affected Anna Williams's personal life. Well, in the last few sentences on the topic of Anna Williams in this chapter in Van Allen and Mallis's book, we learn that fame does in fact affect her personal and professional life, with Van Allen and Mallis saying, quote, Miss Williams, who later became a successful kindergarten school teacher and philosophical writer, received thousands of letters and visitors at her home and school. These attentions greatly troubled her, and it was some time before the furor died down, end quote. So what do we unpack from these two sentences? Excuse me. Well, like we did in chapter 2 of this presentation, when we dissected 2 sentences from this page as well, page 75, we can learn a lot, excuse me, we can learn a lot from the sentences. We learn that she was a successful school teacher, specifically kindergarten. We learn about how she was a philosophical writer. We learn that she was indeed affected quite a bit by the newspaper man's revelation. We learn that she received an extreme amount of letters, and I bolded this here, visitors to her home and her school. So not just her residence, which is frightening enough, but they showed up at her school while she's teaching kindergarten students, which is absolutely frightening. In my opinion, it's appalling, because she's trying to do her job, trying to teach young children, and then all of a sudden you have these people coming in absolutely infatuated with you, and it's interrupting your course of the day. So interrupting your course of business. It's subsequently, the stress of that must have affected her ability to teach well and teach effectively, especially to little kids. We also learned from the Numismatist magazine that she was offered stage engagements. She was offered speaking engagements, but she turned those down as well. She rejected those. So let's switch away from Van Allen and Mallis. Although the book's chapter, like I said, has been absolutely invaluable in learning more about Anna Williams' life, I'd like to focus on a prime example of the public recognition she got, particularly written, and how she was receiving, and how it affected her personal life being in the spotlight. So let's look at this example. This is from the American Numismatic Association's The Numismatist magazine, published in July of 1896, titled, quote, "To Marry a Goddess, a young lady whose profile appears on Uncle Sam's Silver Dollars," end quote. So right away, in that title, we know that people are enthralled with the idea that not only is the depiction of liberty on this new shiny George Morgan designed silver dollar, the one right here, that one, is a real human being from Philadelphia. But not just that her life is now in the public eye. Specifically, her news of being engaged in 1892 when this was published. It's important to note, though, and we're jumping a bit ahead, but it's important to note, in the end, she was not married. She did not get married. We see here in the beginning of the article the snippet that Anna Williams is, quote, "the woman whose face is known to more people than that of any other woman on the American continent," which, right here, the woman whose face is known to more people than any other woman on the American continent. Just let that sink in for a minute. Like we said, your seemingly average, everyday school teacher, kindergarten teacher, is now suddenly the most famous woman on the American continent in 1892. Stunning. So it's no wonder why that this troubled her, like I previously mentioned from Van Allen and Mallis. It's astounding because it puts the weight of suddenly being famous to that extent in context for us. And like I said, how she must have felt that pressure and that weight for something as simple as sitting with another artist, her father's friend who was an artist. Her father's friend's friend, both of them artists, all she did was sit with them and she was a model. Her portrait was taken of her face. And now suddenly she's the most famous woman on the American continent. Absolutely fascinating and astounding, really. But let's jump to the end of the second paragraph, which reinforces what Van Allen and Mallis says about her identity being a secret. With this article saying, quote, "The friends of the young woman placed every obstacle in learning, in the way of possible identification, but failed in their object." So let me read that again for you. Quote, "The friends of the young woman placed every obstacle in the way of possible identification, but failed in their object," end quote. So that was from the same article that we just read, that quote from this one right here. So it reinforces what we know, that she wanted to remain private. That was her deal with George Morgan. Listen, I don't want to be known for this. I'm just doing this for you, as probably most likely as a favor. That would be my guess, is that she did it as a favor for George Morgan and her father's friend, Thomas Eakins. Again, she didn't know her father that well because he passed away when he was young. And it's possible, there's no written evidence of this, but it is my guess that she did that as a favor to her father's friend, that she sat with George Morgan. Because remember, she was persuaded by her friends to sit with George Morgan. So, and we know that didn't work. What her friends tried to do didn't work in the end, unfortunately for Anna. So let's jump down to the middle and the end of the article, because this is where we learn and reinforce some of the things we learned so far. The article talks about George Morgan, naturally, and that he wanted to work on the obverse design. The article towards the middle says, quote, George Morgan, his attention was then turned to the other side, and his original inclination was to place on it a fanciful head representing the goddess of liberty. But the ambitious designer was too much of a realist to be satisfied with a mere product of fancy, end quote. So when they said, the Numismatist magazine says, turn to the other side, they're referring to the other side of the coin, because they first talk about the reverse, which is the heraldic eagle, as we know. This is important for chapter 4 that we're going to get into of this presentation in terms of her legacy. I did want to mention it, that a fanciful head representing the goddess of liberty was a mere product of fancy for the realist. I'm paraphrasing that quote. So that's important. We're going to get to that in chapter 4, but I did want to mention that. So the final quote I'm going to take from this Numismatist article, the Numismatist article, is that the last two sentences say, quote, she carries her figure with a stateliness rarely seen, and the pose of the head is exactly as seen on the silver dollar. The features of Miss Williams are reproduced as faithfully as in a good photograph, end quote. So notwithstanding the old English used in this article, you know, the quote, stateliness rarely seen and the pose of the head, end quote, sounds extremely formal and a little odd now if you were to write this in 2020, but it emphasizes the point that the portrait of the coin and her physical portrait were really one and the same. And before we move to chapter 4, I wanted to bring up a point about her actions later in life and further back up the claim that she was definitely not interested in the spotlight and national infatuation thrown upon her so suddenly. What I noticed was that the fact she waited 13 years from identification by that newspaper man in 1879 to do just one public interview in 1892 that we cited earlier in this presentation. How we learned about her family was from that public interview. Someone that really wants to maintain a public appearance of that level does not disappear from public life for 13 years and expect to maintain that level of attention and infatuation from the general public. So it's just another example, if we're just going to take away from what she actually said, that she was greatly troubled by the attention, that she waited 13 years for it to sort of blow over before she talked about it from her perspective and gave an interview. So let's go now to the final chapter of the presentation, chapter 4, Anna Willess Williams, the legacy that she wanted. And so we're going to go over some of the chapter highlights here now. So we're going to talk about her death and the primary source document that I kept hinting at earlier, that it would be her death certificate. That's the primary source in terms of determining her age, her birth year. That was further verified and supported by Van Allen and Mallis in their book. We're going to talk about the Anna Willess Williams legacy. And then we're going to talk about some theories that I uncovered in my research, that it wasn't necessarily Anna Williams. That's what the theory is claiming, that it wasn't Anna Williams, either in whole or in part, on the Morgan dollar right there. And then my response, of course, to theories 1 and 2. So the death certificate here, we see that Anna Willess Williams died on April 17th, 1926, at the age of 68 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Her death certificate lists the death as apoplexy. And again, these red bars, I added those. That's emphasis mine. So we can see here, apoplexy due to a cerebral hemorrhage. And then down here, if you can see it, it says in blue, due to a fall. And I'm just going to zoom in here so you can see it a little bit better. Here we see, it's important to note the misspelling of her middle name. It's an interesting misspelling. Plus, we have a mathematical error here. She was 68, yet it lists her as 78. Both of them are simply, in my opinion, typos, written typos. But we do have the correct birth year, correct birthday and birth year listed right here. And like I mentioned, she was engaged in 1892, but she died single. So that engagement was unsuccessful. And if we go back up, I want to mention, remember Catherine, her niece from chapter 1 in the census records? Here she is again. Interesting that either she or the person recording her name listed her first letter as a K instead of a C, but Catherine Williams is there, and she acted as we can see right here, the informant. That's exactly what Anna Williams did for her brother Samuel when he passed away. Same exact layout in terms of death certificate, because they both passed away in Pennsylvania. And we can see here as well, same address that Anna Williams lived at and her niece Catherine. So let's talk about the Anna Willess Williams legacy. We talked all about her. We talked all about her and George Morgan. We talked all about the need for a new dollar coin. We talked all about her being a part of the design. But what did she want to be remembered for? And thankfully, Allen and Mallis help us explain that. She made it clear that she was troubled by the whole dollar coin situation, Morgan dollar coin situation. Like we said, she was greatly troubled by it. But in the Numismatist in 1926, who did a subsequent article that we're going to talk about shortly, she called it a, quote, incident of my youth, unquote. She didn't want to be remembered for being the lady on the Morgan dollar. That much is clear. It's clear she wanted to be remembered as a teacher, an educator, an intellectual, and a devout Baptist first. She wanted to be remembered as a teacher, an educator, and a devout Baptist first. She was also an intellectual, a philosophical writer. She wanted to be remembered that as well, more important than being in numismatics. And I circle this bullet point here. She was the winner of a best original essay on psychology in 1891, which further proves the point that she was, at her core, an intellectual. She was a teacher. She was an educator. She was a devout Baptist. And she made it very clear that numismatics was last. But before I researched her life, I was unaware that she didn't care for any recognition for being Lady Liberty. She didn't care for any of that. She wanted to be remembered, like I said, for these reasons. But had we not known her for her numismatics, for her influence in numismatics, we very well likely would not be discussing her right now. So it's interesting how the reasons she wanted to be remembered were completely different from what she actually was remembered for and is continuing to be remembered for. She is simply known as the lady on the Morgan dollar. She isn't remembered as loyal school teacher, loyal educator, an intellectual, a really good writer, a winner of writing awards on psychology. She's remembered as simply the lady on the Morgan dollar, which really boils it down and leaves out a lot of important things as we learned about her life. So, like I said, I want to talk about the theories very quickly that it wasn't Anna Williams. And very briefly, we learned from May 1926 in the Numismatist that they claim, quote, this is born, they're talking about how it doesn't really look like her. Quote, this is borne out by the fact that the entire head is much more mature in appearance than that would be expected in a girl 18 years old, end quote. So that's the first year theory. She's partially involved because she doesn't exactly look an 18-year-old, well, they got the year wrong in this, but a younger person doesn't exactly look like that. So that's the claim, the first claim. The second theory, Anna Williams was not involved. And we learn thanks to Wayne Homran, who is the editor of the Numismatic Bibliomanist Society's Asylum newsletter, and in particular issue from April 28, 2002, that George Morgan's daughter wrote a letter with a very interesting quote saying, quote, Father always said no matter how many models posed for him, that he never bid any and that he just made up the obverse himself, end quote. So that's the second claim, that she wasn't involved. Anna Williams wasn't involved at all. And I'm going to quickly address these two to you now. My response to that second theory, that she wasn't involved at all, I could not find a single piece of evidence supporting this claim anywhere other than this letter. It gives me rise to caution because, as we learned today, being very meticulous and knowing your sources helps you get the correct information. And this is the only source that claims this. I cannot back this up or support it with any other claim. And it's also important to mention there's no public mention of this by George Morgan himself anywhere, which would verify this claim. So George Morgan himself never said this anywhere, from what we know. And that all other evidence presented to you today in this presentation contradicts this claim entirely. Are you raising your hand, Brianna? You're muted, by the way.
You have 5 minutes.
Yeah, I'm just about done. I want to take questions. So my second response to this, my response to the first claim that it didn't look like her, I want to introduce you to, again, Thomas Eakins and his work. This is a portrait he did in 1878, 2 years after she sat in his home with George Morgan, and he made this portrait of her. She would have been age 21 in this. And we can see, I'm 21. She doesn't really look like someone my age, to be perfectly honest with you. So we can see here that you could definitely surmise that this portrait of her in 1878 looks very similar to what's actually on the Morgan dollar, which makes me think that this theory may be somewhat correct. I would agree that maybe, because the part of the claim is that maybe Morgan used some of the Greek influences that we learned about, that keeps coming up, these Greek art influences that we keep learning about in the design, and maybe that's the case. But personally, I disagree with the numismatist said in the 1926 article that she didn't really look the part. And that's just a zoom in of each, and you can see here. So in conclusion, we learned about a very influential woman today. Her contributions to numismatics, in my opinion, were incredible. Without her portrait and willingness to sit with George Morgan, one of the most iconic designs in American numismatics would look vastly different and wouldn't have the same meaning that it does to have a real person, a real woman who really fought through her hardships on the front of that design. We learned what she wanted to be remembered for, which was a loyal, determined educator, a devout Baptist, an ardent philosophical writer, and lastly, someone who was absolutely crucial to one of the single most influential American silver dollar designs in numismatic history. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you so much for listening today. I have the works cited here. I can provide those. I'm going to quickly run through them. I can provide those to you if you'd like on a PDF. But that concludes the influence of Anna Williams in numismatics. I'd be happy to take any questions or comments now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jack. I really appreciate your time. I know I learned a whole bunch, and I bet everybody else did as well. I'm going to go ahead and launch the survey really quick. Please take a moment just to take the survey. It's only 9 questions, very, very easy. While this is going on, I'm going to read any questions that come through. So somebody said, extremely well organized presentation. Thank you. 1 grammar point, not to be able to, oh, never mind. Don't read that. So they said thank you. No, the rest.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so it says, I'm surprised Anna's friends didn't spill the beans about her identity and the Morgan dollar before the newspaper man. I was wondering if you think Anna's fame was a primary reason for her never marrying. As a young woman in her early 20s, I think she would have had many prospects in her fame. Also, do you think Anna liked the way her likeness was portrayed in the Morgan dollar?
So that's a great question. Thank you to whoever asked that. I did see in the course of my research, let me just fast forward here to thank you. I did see in the course of my research that the claim her engagement fell through because of this whole ordeal. I couldn't find, in my opinion, a really good source to back that up. I didn't find any like primary source documents or a quotation maybe to that extent. I didn't see that, so I didn't want to include that in case it was incorrect, because as you can probably see, I tried to be as meticulous as possible in terms of finding the valuable sources that are correct or researched. I didn't want to include that, but I did see that she, unfortunately, the claim is that her engagement fell through because of all of the fame and visitors and inundation of just everybody wanting to know her. It fell through because of that. And to your second question about whether she would have found someone because of this, it's a very interesting question. I don't know, to be perfectly honest with you. I don't know what that must have been like for her in the everyday, literally every day, waking up and then meeting new people and other people. If she was ever introduced to people as the goddess of liberty, or she kind of controlled that public and personal life, had to do that because it was forced upon her. I don't know, to be perfectly honest with you, whether that helped influence her meet new people, in particular people she wanted to be in a relationship with. We do know in the end that she did not have a successful engagement and then was never married at the end of her life, towards the end of her life.
Somebody else said, thank you so much. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Why do you think the Morgan dollar on Anna Williams' image have captured the imagination of America?
Could you repeat that?
Yeah. Why do you think the Morgan dollar and Anna Williams' image have captured the imagination of America?
Honestly, even though we don't hear about it, except for this presentation, it's the story of Anna Williams, in my opinion, especially for the obverse design, that really makes it one of America's favorite silver dollars. That's my opinion. Especially, and I'll back that up, especially for the people that lived with the design when it first came out, because they would have been in the public life seeing the story that I just told you about Anna Williams. They would have learned about Anna Williams from the press, from articles like I mentioned about her being married. The absolute infatuation of society with Anna Williams, like I said earlier, the fact that people now realize that this virtue of liberty was an actual person, in the sense that, wow, the person that I see here, I can potentially meet that person and get to know them. And it's the story of being the everyday average, I don't want to call her average, but in this sense, average American, in terms of not being, famous or royalty. She wasn't a queen. They weren't doing portraits of a queen or anything like that. She was your regular American citizen. And especially for people that saw this, looked up to it and said, wow, maybe one day I'll be on a coin. That could be considered as part of the allure of the American success story on the coin, and especially from the perspective of people that actually learned and grew up with this coin from when they lived. I'm not talking about subsequent people learning about it like this year who wouldn't exactly know who Anna Williams was other than the lady on it. If you were living in 1878 and you read all these stories about this regular school teacher that is now on everyone's money, it's really an impressive a feat in a great success story. So I think that would answer. I hope that answers your question.
Another question that came in. Also, it looks like only a few people haven't taken the survey. If you haven't taken the survey, please do before you jump off. That'll really help us out. Let's see. Did you find Anna's life tragic or heroic?
That's a great question. That's a really great question. I think a little bit of both. I'm obviously not an expert in her life because I'm only sharing what I learned through research. But from what it sounds like, up until the point where it physically and emotionally affected her in the everyday life, especially with her engagement, I would say it was a success story. And like I said, how it helped people in the day possibly say, maybe one day I'll be on the next dollar coin. Anna Williams was a school teacher. she's not royalty. She's not a queen. She's not, how in England or in the UK, how they have to have the monarch's portrait on the obverse, or at least that's featured on their coins. Over in America, even though it's liberty, the basis of liberty was a real person. So in that sense of success story, I would call it a success story. But in terms of tragedy, it would definitely be what happened after 1879. Losing your engagement because of absolute and total public infatuation is tragic. It's absolutely tragic. So it's a little bit of both. I hope that answers your question. Thank you for a great question.
Great. Well, we are just over time, so we're going to have to end it here. Again, thanks so much, Jack, for your time. We really appreciate all of the work that you have put into this. Thanks for everybody that stayed on to the very end with us. If you come up with questions later on that you would like to ask, you can send them to me, seminars@money.org, and then I'll forward them to Jack and he can get those answered.
Absolutely.
Our next presentation is going to be tomorrow. It's going to be with Rod Gillis, and it's going to be strategies to dispose of your collection. If you have not signed up for that one, there's still plenty of room, so please feel free to jump on. This presentation was recorded, so if you know anybody that would be interested in that couldn't join us today, please send it to them so they can enjoy it as well. And Jack, we have a certificate of appreciation coming to you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. We appreciate your time, and thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you everyone for watching. I appreciate it. Have a good night.